She's conservative, and I'm liberal, and yet we've been friends for almost 40 years. Everyone says you shouldn't discuss politics, religion, or money. And we say that's exactly what friends should be talking about. Join us as we tackle the conversations you're having in your head, but are too scared to say out loud. Welcome to We've Got to Talk. Welcome, Jolene, and welcome, Stephen Hawkins.
We are so excited to have Stephen Hawkins with us today. He is the Director of Research for More in Common, where he leads studies exploring the psychology of political division across 9 countries. Stephen authored the landmark study Beyond MAGA, a profile of the Trump coalition, which I know, listener and viewer, you have already seen us talk about. It was a podcast that we aired last month. His work focuses on understanding the ideology, biases, and values that shape how people see the world. Did I say all that right, Stephen?
You said it all right. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you so much for being here.
So, Stephen, tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to More in Common.
I have something in common with each of you in that I have spent a lot of time in the conservative world and a lot of time in the progressive world, including kind of professionally. My story's a little bit complicated. I have an international background. I grew up overseas, mostly in Brazil. But I moved to the U.S. to come to college, and I went to GW here in Washington, D.C., where I live. And at the time, it was considered among the most politically active schools in the country, if not number one. And it's right by the White House and the State Department and the National Mall. And I quickly got onto the College Republicans Executive Board. It was a huge thrill for me at age 19 to be meeting congressmen and senators and governors and to be involved in, at the time, it was the John McCain era and the 2008 campaign. And had a kind of change of perspective when I was in college that led me to being more secular and more liberal. And if you fast forward till after grad school, so fast forward about 8 years, I moved to New York City and started working for an LGBTQ-run activist organization in Manhattan that was trying to change people's minds on climate change and women's rights and Black Lives Matter and all of the things. And so I kind of swung from the evangelical Christian conservative Southern Republican background that I started with all the way over to the cosmopolitan progressive worldview, secular worldview, and learned a lot about the psychology and values of the people in both of those worlds. And in my late 20s, we got invited to lead the research for this new initiative called More in Common. And what they were trying to do is they're trying to understand what is changing about our societies, where it seemed like we had a consensus around certain values and certain issues. And in particular, they were concerned about what was happening in Europe, where there was a huge backlash to migration that started in 2016, 2017. And they wanted to understand what was happening and how Europeans were responding to that, because the kind of typical left-right framing wasn't working. And so I have been with More in Common now since that period. So it's been about 10 years that I've been working with More in Common. And I'll just conclude by saying that today the organization has about 75 staff, and we're operating in, as you mentioned, soon to be in 9 countries. And so we're all over Europe, the UK, we're in Brazil, we're in the United States, we're expanding to Australia, we're expanding to Ireland. And just to give a sentence or two about what we do, we work with social psychologists and political scientists to provide a better understanding, a richer, more human understanding of what's going on in our societies that are fractured, that are distrusting, that are atomized, that are suffering from media bubbles. And we write reports about this content, and then we give briefings to philanthropy, to politicians and political parties, to the nonprofit world, and engage with the media. And we hope that this work will help bring a stronger sense of social cohesion to our societies in a moment that really needs it.
So, okay, one of the things that you said that I think has triggered me is, number one, so it's not just the United States is so screwed up right now. Like this is happening, this phenomenon is happening throughout the whole world. Is that right?
It's happening in a lot of places. It's happening, Brazil, where I grew up, it's a very different country in a lot of ways, and it's very different actually in its political institutions. It's not exactly the same as the United States. And yet it suffers from an almost identical set of plagues where you have very, very similar fights going on between the left and the right there. In Europe, we're seeing a lot of polarization and political division too, especially around issues of immigration and Islam. And everywhere where we work, we're also seeing a decline in trust in our institutions, right? At a moment where there's a lot of uncertainty about the future, and in a moment where there's a kind of malaise in our culture, institutions could step up and provide leadership, but they're actually not trusted. And so we're seeing those themes across countries wherever we work. It's not just the U.S., although I think we're kind of leading the way.
Yeah. I mean, didn't More in Common start because of a tragedy in England? Is that
That's right. That's
fair
right.
to say?
It's very fair to say. So, I began working with the founders of More in Common in 2016, and then a few months into my tenure with them, sadly, tragically, a member of parliament named Jo Cox, a woman named Jo Cox, she was attacked and killed by someone in her district, and she was meeting with constituents, and he approached her in public, and he shot her and stabbed her. He had been plotting this. And as he was killing her, he yelled, "Britain first, Britain first."
Wow.
Because she was a vocal advocate for helping particularly Syrian refugees to settle into the United Kingdom, where they're fleeing from civil war. And so she was killed by a white nationalist. And she told her staff to clear out of the way, and she took the brunt of it, and she left behind 2 kids and her husband, as well as a heartbroken nation. There was a total national outpouring of grief and love for her. Maybe in a way that feels similar to Gabby Giffords, but of course with a worse ending. So the phrase "more in common" comes from her first speech in Parliament, where she talked about her constituents having more in common than what divides them. So the organization owes a legacy to her.
Were you also always in the United States? Or did that start with the 2018 Hidden Tribes report, which then, I'm guessing, because that was one of my questions, like what is different about the Hidden Tribes report versus the Beyond MAGA report that came out in January of 26?
We did start in Europe. That was our primary focus. Our first research projects were in France and Germany, and then we've also done them in Italy and Greece. And so we were focused on Europe for a little while, because what happened in Europe was millions of people came from places as far away as Afghanistan, Syria, North Africa, still ongoing. Large draw towards Europe and a very large border, a maritime border. And the continent needed to grapple with how to deal with this. And there were, we described a conflicted middle, where a lot of people have empathy for people who are surviving and escaping war. And they believe in the principle that when somebody is fleeing because their family is unsafe because of bombs being dropped in over their house or their town, they should have a country to flee to. And that, in principle, we want our country to be a place where those people can be safe. That's a very broad feeling that Europeans have, that Brits have, and I would argue that Americans have. The challenge comes that people then have concerns of different types, economic concerns. Are these people who are going to be able to assimilate into our economy and contribute in any way? Cultural concerns. Do these people share our values, especially places like France that really have a reverence around being secular and keeping religion out of the public space? Even wearing a cross, for instance, is something which is largely not allowed in public spaces, like work and school, things like this in France. Security concerns: are there going to be terrorist attacks? People in Germany being afraid to go to Christmas markets now, that sort of thing. And so that ambivalence was what we were trying to study, because we're trying to, where do people net out on this, where you have valid competing concerns about what's happening, and you have to kind of lean in one direction or the other. And how much skepticism do people have versus empathy and grace that they're giving? And so that's why we started in Europe, was to try and understand all of those different cohorts of people and how they were thinking about the issue. So our first study in the U.S. was Hidden Tribes, which we released in 2018. What we were trying to do with that was, if you go back to 2018, this is kind of post-Me Too era. It's kind of in the middle of the Black Lives Matter era, but before George Floyd. It's before COVID. And much of the discussion is really about identity and racial groups and gender. And so much of the political discourse was focused on those categories, as well as, of course, red versus blue, urban versus rural. And because I had spent so much time in the conservative world and in the progressive world, those dividing lines felt far too simplistic, because I knew myself that my demographics hadn't changed and I had changed my worldview. And so there's something there which is dynamic, and it's about how you understand the world, and it's about what you value. And so that's what I wanted to help articulate, and I worked with my dear friend and colleague Daniel Yudkin, who has a PhD in social psychology, and he helped bring in the academic literature that talks about those differences in psychology and values. And then we were able to use those to paint a different picture of American division. And it's based on people's inner lives, their psychology, and their political engagement, not based on their demographics. And that's how we came up with our 7-group typology, so that very quickly the 7 groups are progressive activists, traditional liberals, passive liberals, politically disengaged, moderates, traditional conservatives, and devoted conservatives. And those 7 groups provide a more refined picture of where the division actually is in our country than any of those other groups that I just mentioned, because you have black and white, male and female people within all of those groups. The other concept that really came out of that work in 2018 was this idea of an exhausted majority. And that was really what people held on to, and which still gets discussed in politics and the media sometimes today, is this idea of an exhausted majority. And I would say that that's where I sit as well. I talked about kind of my transition from right to left, but genuinely, I'm not just someone who considers himself to be fully on the left, because I still see a lot of value in what the conservative perspective provides in terms of emphasis around things like character formation, around family, around the importance of ritual, around humility, and much of the Christian worldview is something that I have held on to. And so I find that the group lens and the power lens that progressives bring to the table, it does a lot of explanatory work. But that you're missing so much of the individual experience if you don't have a language for things like character and forgiveness and redemption and family.
When did the idea of Beyond MAGA come? How did it go from that to Beyond MAGA?
A lot of years passed, and we needed to update our model. We had a change in president to Biden, and then a change in president back to Trump 2.0. And we wanted to update the model. And the question we wanted to start with was, who supports President Trump in 2024? It was a very surprising election in that, or at least to some people it was, in that the story people were telling about President Trump's election in 2016 was that he had won over racists. That's a big part of what it was. White old men in particular had gone to vote for President Trump. And that was kind of a big narrative of who he had won over. In 2024, President Trump was elected by the youngest, most racially diverse coalition that has elected a Republican in like 50 years. And so that begs questions. Who are these people who are joining the coalition that are younger, that are African American, that are Muslim, that are women? What are they seeing in President Trump or not seeing in the Democratic Party and their candidates? And so we wanted to take on that question. And from that, the Beyond MAGA report was born. And I'll just mention also that our Hidden Tribes 2.0 project is ongoing. So as we speak, we are going back out into the field to update our Hidden Tribes typology for 2026.
Can we talk about the Beyond MAGA report? Because so I voted for Trump, and as we've talked about 100 times on this show, because I had two choices, right? I mean, I am not a Trump fan for the most part, but I had a choice between, Kamala and Trump. So that's who I voted for. So I loved taking the the test because it truly identified exactly why I voted for him. And now Nicole, who did not vote for Trump, also took the test
for fun
to see what she would be if she would have voted for him, and she was exactly what we all would have.
But the irony, Joe, is that we both were reluctant, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Right.
And one thing,
100%.
Stephen, that I thought was really cool for Jolene is that, and I say this with love, Jolene is she doesn't trust necessarily, so she's always like into a good conspiracy and things like that. Mm-hmm. And she looked at that quiz and she was like, "These were really good questions. I didn't feel manipulated." Is this fair to say, Joe? I don't want to put words in your mouth, which I thought was really exciting, and why I was so excited that you shared, Stephen, what your background was. Because to me, I don't even know how to ask this question. It might just be more of a observation. You seem like the singular perfect person to write these questions because you have such a vast experience of your life between how you grew up, the beliefs you had, and also having the international experience. We don't know each other, but it seems like a deep empathy and curiosity about all sides. That it seemed like you were the perfect person to write questions that Jolene could trust.
Oh, that is good. Yeah.
I appreciate that. That's so kind of you. And I'm going to take that compliment because I think it's a contribution that I try to continue to make, which is sit within the psychology of somebody who's different from you, and then back in your own shoes, and then somebody else. And, the compliment I'm most proud of receiving about the Hidden Tribes work was a day in Washington, D.C. I was with some of the other co-authors on the report, and we had a morning meeting with a progressive think tank who had helped fund the project, and they were enthusiastic about our description of what was happening in the country, and they approved of it, and they were grateful. And then in the afternoon, we went to a very conservative think tank, a socially conservative think tank. And one of the people in that boardroom in the conservative think tank picked up the report and held it in his hands. He goes, "I looked at it from over here, and I couldn't see the bias. I looked at it from over here, and I couldn't see the bias." And then it's like, if there's one place in which you might be biased, it's towards being hopeful. He goes,
my gosh.
And so the validation from the left and from the right of the report as having been even-handed, that's it's not easy to achieve that.
Absolutely.
And I think conservatives especially, because they feel underrepresented by the mainstream institutions of media in particular.
100%.
They have their guard up when it comes to anything that is about talking about Trump or Trump supporters.
If we looked at polling that took place prior to the elections, which again, Nicole's already said, I don't know if I would go so far as to say I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I could be talked into one. I don't think people are honest in their polling because they don't want to admit who they want to vote for. So I think that's why people like Nicole were so surprised on election night. Like, where did this come from? How could more than half of the nation be voting Republican when that's not what the polling showed? And do you find that? I mean, as you go through and formulate these questions and all that people are then more willing to talk about it after the fact because they're so afraid to admit maybe before the fact?
After the first President Trump election, there was a lot of discussion and polling about the shy Trump voter, which I think is a poor characterization. I think, Joe, yours is better because it's not really being timid. It's having an aversion to being judged. But you could see systematically that the way that people reported supporting Trump online was higher than the level of support that they would find when they would do telephone interviews where you have to tell somebody, right? And so that was quite a tell, right? Because a lot of research, of course, is done online. We don't see too much aversion to being honest about opinions supporting Trump, and we ask a lot of thorny questions. We want to know people's views on race and racism and crime and Islam and terrorism and transgender athletes and gender issues and gender differences. Like, we want to understand how people think about these questions, and we want to do it in a way that reflects the language of our moment. And that's also something that we tried to do in Beyond MAGA was, there's a formality that has kind of eroded in our politics and been replaced with something which holds our attention more and that, is accessible. And President Trump is a very effective communicator because he speaks to a very general audience rather than speaking in academic speak or in bureaucrat speak. And so some of our questions tried to reflect that too, which is that we're trying to enter into a dialogue with people where they are rather than, structure things in the language of our world.
Stephen, for those of us that have not us, but those of our viewers that haven't seen our episode and haven't read your report, can you do a small summary about what your findings were with the Beyond MAGA, the different types, and also what was surprising to you in doing the report?
Sure, of course. So the Beyond MAGA report identifies 4 groups. So they are, in this order, MAGA hardliners, anti-woke conservatives, mainline Republicans, and the reluctant right. And they're not too different in size. They range between 20 and 30% in size, basically, with the largest ones being the mainline Republicans and the MAGA hardliners. And basically what we found is that the original research question that I mentioned about who the people are that are bringing, who the reinforcements are coming into the Trump camp that helped him get elected in 2024, a lot of them sit within this world of the reluctant right. And the reluctant right are people who identify as moderate or slightly conservative. They're not especially politically engaged. They do care about the economy. They care about inflation and prices. And that was so central to Trump's message and to the lack of appeal in Harris's candidacy. And they are also concerned about the border. I think that was a broadly popular stance that President Trump had, was in securing the border. And they're not progressive in the sense that they are motivated by issues like abortion, climate change, and transgender rights. And what we saw in 2024 was that there was a real mismatch between how Democrats wanted to be perceived and how they actually were perceived by the electorate. Democrats wanted to be perceived as focused on the economy because that's what matters to you. But we did a study, and we wrote up the results of this and had an article in The Atlantic about it, that showed that Americans, including Republicans and Democrats, thought that Democrats were motivated by those 3 issues I just mentioned: abortion, climate change, and transgender rights. And so, there's a moment of concern that Americans are having that their salaries can't cover their bills and that they don't feel like we're not safeguarding the country. And the reputation of Democrats is, well, they want to focus on social issues and big global problems and questions of justice that don't relate necessarily to me directly. And so that's the reluctant right would have been part of that group that were just like, well, if I have to pick between these 2 options, I'm going to go with the guy who's probably going to do the sensible things on the economy. And that included a lot of younger men who told us that they made the decision about who to vote for weeks or days before the election, which wasn't true for the other 3 groups, the mainline Republicans, anti-woke conservatives, and the MAGA hardliners. I'll just say one more thing about the key findings that I think is really interesting. The MAGA hardliners, which are 29% of Trump voters, their support for President Trump is really tied up in their identity. It's not just, I want these policies, and this is the mechanism for getting these policies done. That's a transactional relationship. That's not the basis of the MAGA hardliner relationships with Trump. For them, it's more, this is my identity and my values. I'm proud to be American. Usually, or very often, I'm proud to be a Christian, and that's really important to how I see myself and what I want my family to be like. And I am, deeply committed to also the Republican Party. And President Trump embodies more than just policy preferences. He embodies a person that they feel personally connected to. And so we talk about these different roles that President Trump plays for the MAGA hardliners, who are his most diehard supporters. And they include him having a constructive role. I think from the critical perspective of President Trump from the outside, Trump is seen as a destroyer. He's wrecking things, and he's coming in with a negative agenda. But for Trump voters, the number one metaphor that people use was, no, this is a builder trying to fix a broken system. And he's coming in with that business acumen to do it. And so the MAGA hardliners have a type of relationship with President Trump that I don't think we see any corresponding parallels to on the left. I don't think there was a Biden hardliners group that we would have found on the left that was just like, he's our man forever, and I feel so personally connected to him. I don't think so. And so Trump has created something singular there.
So do you think, though, that this polarization then, and you kind of touched on this about the perception gap, right? I mean, that Democrats have this perception of the Republicans, the Republicans have this perception of the Democrats. This polarization that we're having right now, how did it become more than just political disagreements? I mean, we talked about, I talked about loving Newt Gingrich because I think when he got in there, it was like, okay, what are the things that we all agree on? Let's, we really agree on 80% of the things, so let's start there and, contract with America and all that. Now it is so polarized. How did that happen? I mean, was it social media? Was it news? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It does have everything to do with incentives. So there's something which I sometimes refer to as the polarization ecosystem, and it's a lot of what you just mentioned there, Jolene, which is that what social media algorithms have figured out is that good news is something that makes you smile, but things that make you angry are things that you share. They're things that you engage with. They're things that you comment on. And so it's stickier and more valuable to have negative content than positive content. And studies have shown that on X, for instance, there's a bias towards the negative and inflammatory content over the positive content because it shows this engagement. It elevates the engagement with the platform. The big change also from the 90s is that people have moved towards cable news as their means of getting news as opposed to nightly news hour, which is brief. And the economic model between the previous mainstream news and cable news is very different. The model has moved towards more opinion, towards more division, and towards more negativity, and that has, that changes what the conversation is about. The nightly news anchors of the 70s, 80s, and 90s started out their show going, "How do I make sure that I'm being fair? How do I not alienate my Democrat viewers? How do I not alienate those folks in the South or the conservatives?" And now it's, how do I hold on to my audience that hates the other side? How do I validate them, right? And that is a business model because it's it's audience retention through validation. It's a business model for the social media platforms. And I want to mention one other set of incentives, which is the politicians themselves.
Yes.
So I live in Washington, D.C., and it is criminal how much time you have to spend raising money if you're an elected official in the city. If you are a member of Congress, you need to be spending between 40 and 70% of your time raising money when you're in D.C., not when you're back in your district among your constituents.
Oh my gosh.
You're on the phone at your party headquarters, and you're spending effectively 2 to 3 days of your week calling people in San Francisco or New York or somewhere else, and you're asking them for $5,000 and $10,000 donations, and you're doing this as the primary activity of your job. And so I'll mention something else that just happened along the way. 2 more things, just because I love this question. One is there wasn't C-SPAN until the late 70s, right? It was part of the Watergate reforms was that there was more transparency, so they put cameras into Congress. And so the incentive then was, well, let's pass good bills and good laws, and let's do good regulatory work, et cetera. When the cameras came on, it started to shift a little bit towards, how can I get attention out of this moment? How can I fundraise off of this? And what we have seen is people who, I'm not going to name names, but there's a great example from the Republican Party of this, but it's true on the Democratic side as well. People who have shifted intentionally from being moderate to being combative have seen within their first fundraising cycle a shift of 5 to 7x more fundraising, right? Wow. So imagine if your job primarily is to raise money, and there's a move you can make which makes it You can spend 20% as much time and get the same amount of funding for it, right? And get rewarded by your party because you're helping your party's brand. So the incentives in the traditional news world, in the social media world, and in the fundraising world are all towards this conflict and the preservation of this conflict, and not towards resolving it and setting it aside.
Okay, so then how do we fix it? I was going to say, do you think things are going to get any better? I mean, if that's what the system is feeding into, I mean, we're not going to fix it, are we?
I mean, that's the thing. Okay, this might be a really dumb question, but what's the money for?
They're raising money for their campaigns. So basically, it's not a form of personal corruption. What's happening is every 2 years, members of Congress have to run for re-election, and they have to set a target. Maybe it's $3 or $4 million that they need to raise to have a good election, and they need to win their primary. Usually the primary is the more contested election because that's more competitive. So many congressional districts have been drawn so that there's a clear majority of one party or the other. So when you get to the general election, mostly people live in America, mostly people live in districts where there's hardly ever been somebody from the other party representing them. So they have to win their primary. And to win the primary, they need to have a budget for TV, for radio, for digital, and they need to have a campaign staff, and they need to get volunteers out, and they need to do lawn signs, and they need to be able to host dinners where they raise more money. So that's what they're doing. They're raising money so that they can stay in power. And it's not the elected officials' fault that this is the game, but this is the game that they're playing.
Has the game always been like this, or is it worse now?
It's worse now. One of the things which has happened along the way is a camaraderie has declined in Washington, D.C. among members of Congress. Two reasons why, at least two. One of them is it used to be that members of Congress didn't have to spend so much time fundraising. They would come to D.C. and they would raise their families here. So they would have a house in D.C. and their kids would go to school together and they'd be on the same Little League team. And so, your colleague in Congress is also your neighbor, also a parent at your school. And that's basically declined a lot as people fly in and fly out, and the congressional calendar has gotten shorter and shorter, so people are coming in Tuesday to Thursday, and they're spending much more time back in their home district. So that sense of camaraderie has gone down. The other thing that's happened is Newt Gingrich actually has helped bring about this change. Was Republicans had been out of power in Congress for decades, and so he was charged with a way to, how can we get Republicans back in the majority in the House? And there was a norm that changed. And this is a little bit technical, but I find it so interesting. It used to be the case, let's say you represent Virginia. You're from one congressional district in Virginia, and you have a neighboring congressional district where you have your fellow Republican candidate who's running for re-election there. It used to be the case that you don't help out your colleagues in campaigning for them, because if your colleague loses, then you've campaigned against your future member of Congress who's representing the district next to you. Does that make sense? So there's kind of this gentleman's agreement that you don't want to tear down or attack somebody who could end up being a congressman or congresswoman with you if they get elected. So what happened in the 1990s was we said, we got to win. It's not about being nice and getting along with people. We've got to win. So now Republicans and Democrats both will campaign actively in other districts, which just brings the level of animosity up, because it means that there's not a sense of camaraderie coming in, like there's a purpose that's bigger than our party being in power. The purpose of our party being in power seems to have dwarfed the shared purpose of let's do good governance as members of Congress.
Well, that's making me think, Stephen, they just had the Texas runoff on Tuesday. I'm just going to say that the Republican Party funded money towards a Democrat that was a horrible Democrat to get them to win so that Democrats wouldn't vote for them. And thank God she didn't win. I'm forgetting her name.
Is this Jasmine Crockett?
No. No, this just happened. Do you know her name, Joe?
It was Gwendolyn or Gwen.
All I know is she was a raging anti-Semite. And and the Republicans were putting, I guess, a lot of money behind her because they're like, yeah, if we get her in the ticket, then the Democrats won't vote for her. And so we'll have an easier time winning. I don't know if I'm being articulate right now. because I'm too.
This makes total sense. This
right?
makes total sense.
Where you're just, and I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, what are we doing? Like, seriously, what are we doing as a country? And I know that I lean more Pollyannic and bleeding heart, but we are all Americans. And when stuff happens, when bad stuff happens, like, for instance, September 11th, and I lived downtown, I saw the first plane hit Tower 1. It was like, there are no words. There are no words of how bad it was, and I might get emotional. But one thing that I remember so clearly is not only America, but in the first couple days, the world was behind us. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't happen unless there's horror. Like, I feel like as Americans, we've just forgotten. It's all about winning. Like you're saying, Stephen, that people are like, I don't want you to be friends with the other. I don't want you to marry the other. It's gotten so ugly. And I think that's one of the reasons Jolene and I are here and why we were so excited to talk to you. Mm-hmm. Brianna, our producer, I'll shout out Brianna. She was like, oh my God, I can't wait for this conversation with Stephen. And she's in Australia. Like it's, as you know, because you deal with a world organization, like, what are we doing?
It's telling that you bring up September 11th, and a lot of people do, because it's, for those of us, there's now a generation that's adults that doesn't remember 9/11.
Yeah.
But for millennials and older, it really does stand out as this singular moment of real solidarity and connection.
Yeah.
I think there was glimmers of that a little bit in early COVID in the very first days.
I agree.
And weeks of that. And then George Floyd happened that summer, and then that ripped open a Band-Aid, and ripped off the Band-Aid rather, and then the division kind of continued from there. There's kind of three paths forward. This is simplistic, but I think one of them is what you just mentioned, Nicole, which is like, do we require a crisis for us to have coordinated intention in this country? Mm-hmm. Because when COVID happened, we actually did see bills got passed, funding got pushed forward, Operation Warp Speed got a vaccine delivered within months, and there was a sense that there's something bigger and more important than our disagreements here. Mm-hmm. And September 11th created that window too. And right now, if you ask Americans whether they think that the greatest threat comes from abroad or comes from within our country, 4 in 5 say it comes from within our country. And so we're not collectively acting towards a common goal of defeating another ideology or defending ourselves from someone else or working towards some broader project. We're primarily consumed with our own conflict amongst ourselves. So that crisis to create coordination path, I think, sadly, is one that we could just be on. Or one that might be required for us to kind of come to a common consciousness of what matters. Another path is that we don't get that crisis, and so things continue to decline. But there's a third option that I want to mention as well, which is, and here, Joe, I'm coming back to your question from like 15 minutes ago. So,
okay,
like, how do we get out of it? Well, there's a model for how we get out of it that I've been really interested in lately. And it comes from the late 19th century, where the country changed in a really radical way, and mostly for the worse in terms of everyday people's experience in the country. And that happened because basically a lot of wealth was consolidated around new technologies, especially the railroad. And so these big trusts mounted. And for the first time in American history, you really had a kind of set of billionaires. And they were able to really use that power to control municipal governments and the Senate. The Senate wasn't directly elected. And you had problems with currency where farmers had less and less income for their crops, and they were taking out loans, and the value of the currency would actually go up while they were harvesting their crops over the season. And then when they go to sell their crops, they're not able to even pay off their loans that they took out 9 months or 10 months earlier. And at the same time, you have this manufacturing boom from the Industrial Revolution, which is putting a lot of people in factories, and they're not getting treated well. They're working around the clock. They're working 6 or 7 days a week, and they're working from childhood. And then with that comes alcoholism, and with that comes the failure of the Reconstruction era and black people being treated terribly and being in Jim Crow South. And rising inequality. So a lot of the features that we see today, which are things like problems with inflation and currency, new technologies leading to massive consolidation of wealth, a lot of visible, obvious corruption in our society, they kind of defined a moment in the Gilded Age of the end of the 19th century. And what ended up happening was all these different constituencies that wouldn't otherwise have known each other or worked together came together, and they defined a new political party called the People's Party. And this is socialists, this is Christian reformers, this is prohibitionists, this is women's suffragettes, women who are pushing for the right to vote, this is black rights organizers. They all pushed together and defined a common agenda. And what ended up happening was that they thought they were going to start a political party, but instead they defined a common agenda. And that common agenda ended up defining what the next 2 decades looked like. And the reason today that we have the women's right to vote, that we have the secret ballot, that we have the FDA, that we have the 8-hour workday, that we have the direct election of the Senate, all of those things came from the momentum that came out of that effort, where people who are very different from each other said, hang on, power is concentrating in the wrong places. We're all getting screwed over here as a result. And if we work together, we can create a North Star that the political parties are going to have to compete to claim that they're pointed at as well. And that's what happened. And you see Republicans and Democrats in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So this would be people like Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, Howard Taft, competing to get parts of this agenda advanced and succeeding in doing so. And so to summarize, the broad frustrations that we're feeling right now as Americans might create a context in which we decide we care more about building a future that we want our children to grow up in than we do about the conflicts we're having with each other. And so if we can define that well enough, we can reorient the parties towards that agenda and not and change the course of where we're headed.
Wow. Can it happen in 2 years? Will we see this in the next presidential election?
Working on it. We're working on it.
Do you know something we don't know, Stephen? Is there an effort to make this come to fruition?
We and More in Common are trying to help seed this sort of work. Yes.
And I would say that also that there are like independent news media companies that have sprouted up. Like there is positivity in this. It seems that the exhausted middle might not be so exhausted, that there might be some courage happening here, because it takes a lot of effort and courage and curiosity that you do every day, Stephen. I would imagine, like, what makes you hopeful in this work that you do?
Where I find the hope is honestly in seeing that moments have been very, very hard in our country before. I mentioned the Gilded Age, but if you go back to the 1960s, there were hundreds and hundreds of bombings in the year 1968 alone by organized groups, American domestic terror groups like the Weather Underground, like the Ku Klux Klan. There were political assassinations of 2 Kennedys and MLK, and we were in a vicious war in Vietnam that just ripped apart a whole generation of young men and of families. And we pushed through that. And there's something which feels cyclical about that. And I do think it feels like we're trending downwards as a society, like we're in decline. And I think there comes a moment when you ask, are we going to hit rock bottom here? And are we going to aim for something higher that we can all collectively imagine and that we feel responsible for passing along? Or are we going to let the slide just go down even further? And I think we're getting close to that kind of moment, and we've been in these sorts of cycles before. So that makes me hopeful is the history. And the other thing that makes me hopeful is I know a lot of people like each of you who are like committed to Team Red, Team Blue. And when you sit down, one, you often like people a lot more than you think you would.
Yeah.
And two, you often find that their arguments are a lot more persuasive than you might have expected. And in particular, Joe, you said that you wouldn't describe yourself as a conspiracy theorist, but I think a lot of Americans today across the spectrum have really lost a sense of, well, we know this, they've lost a sense of confidence in Washington, D.C. and our institutions. And there are now enough episodes and vignettes and stories that we've collected where we're like, well, but we know that this happened. So the conspiracy theory label actually does kind of fit in this case, when and part of what sadly I think has happened in our country is that the sense of crisis that so many Americans felt when President Trump took office meant that everybody was trying to use their power to try and block him. The news media, maybe some of the nonprofits, maybe some of the universities, maybe some of people within the government. And so all of them said, we have a higher calling or a different mission than to just be truthful or to just pursue our mandated mission for this bureaucracy. So let's try and do what we can because there's a crisis. And what that ended up happening was it eroded the integrity of those institutions because they were trying to do something that they're not built for. Yeah. And now we have institutions which don't seem to be living out their mission. And so Americans are turning more and more to individual people who they feel like they have a connection with or who they trust or who they have an intuition about, and less to the brands and the institutions, which all seem like they've kind of traded their institutional integrity for power, status, or some degree of relevance. And that's a common problem that I think transcends the divide. I
have not heard anyone say that before, and that makes so much sense. The movie that Nicole and I both love is Wag the Dog. And so, I think that's probably where my conspiracy, spidey sense comes up, and I always think of that. But you're right. We lost trust because everybody thought there was a crisis. And so, as the Republican, it was at the CIA, it was at the, FBI, everybody was trying to do their thing to stop this crisis. And, oh God, that's brilliant.
Stephen, before we do a Good for the Soul, do you have anything else that's important for our listeners or viewers to know about you or know about More in Common, or I don't know, give us a pathway forward, anything that you're thinking about?
Well, I think every conversation turns to AI at some point these days.
Yes, it does.
So it does feel a bit remiss to not mention this. Let me just point at a couple threads that I see happening in the country today and how they could be brought together. Gen Z is a different creature. They are not millennials. They are not Gen X. They have a kind of, to put it critically, maybe a self-pity, but to put it affirming, they have a real gripe, a grievance with society that is earned, which is that they haven't known a politics not defined by polarization. They haven't known an economy that treated them as well as treated their parents. And they haven't known a foreign policy which has been successful at achieving anything major. So they've only known the dysfunction. I think they present an opportunity because they're not breaking in the typical left-right way, and they are motivated to see something new happen. The political party or the political agenda or the movement that can tell Gen Z, we're on your side. We want you to have a good future. We're committed to you. We don't know what the future is going to look like. We genuinely don't. 15 years from now, do you think we're still going to be sitting in lecture halls with laptops trying to memorize facts? That seems unlikely. Do we think we're still going to be doing jobs that have words like engineer and coder? I don't know. So people who are just entering the job market now, or who will in the next few years, are genuinely scared. And I think we owe it as a society to affirm our commitment to our future generations, kids, grandkids. We're here for you. We're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that you are taken care of. That is on the table as a requirement, or at least an enticing opportunity for whatever political movement is willing to do it. But they should do it. And so what I see is a broad American concern about AI, and then a generational specific concern about their own future. And that stuff's just not ideological. People aren't caught up in left, right, red, blue when it comes to that. And they can be the kingmaker. Gen Z can swing this thing. We have a very narrow narrowly divided politics in this country, which reflects how weak the parties are. If the parties were really strong and effective, they'd have big, broad, appealing messages, and they'd swing over voters a lot, and they don't, right? They're weak.
Yeah.
And so Gen Z can swing one way or the other for the country. And so what makes me hopeful is that I think our country needs that kind of commitment to younger Americans right now. I'm in my 30s, and I would appreciate it. I would appreciate knowing that whatever comes next, which nobody can tell us, is not going to mean that I'm going to be bankrupted and jobless and homeless. I mean, it's genuinely a fear that people have, not to mention other concerns young people have, like climate change. I think it's both the right thing to do and the politically expedient thing to do. And when those two things converge, I think there's a political moment that we might get to benefit from.
So, and I was going to ask you, and I thought, okay, no, because this answer, we could talk another 30 minutes on this, so I didn't even say anything about AI. But as you started talking about, the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age, I mean, that's what I think. I mean, that's where we are, right? I mean, that's the whole AI thing is going to really determine, I think, where we go as not even as a society, but as a world in the next 10 years. I mean, I think this is happening in the next 5 years, right?
It is. And we know, we've done a bunch of polling on this, and it's not a left-right issue. People are anxious, and it's for different buckets, right? There's a bucket which is, are my kids going to learn how to think and how to talk and how to socialize? Are they going to learn how to solve problems? Are they going to read books? Are they going to learn how to deal with the uncertainty that is just part of being human all of the time? Are they going to cultivate their minds? It's so crucial that we have a sense of intuition and instinct. And that's something which AI doesn't have, and it's something which can only be honed over years of having to make decisions. And if we offload that cognitive skill, then we're going to have people who are kind of flapping about without any capacity to really direct their behavior and their choices. So that's a big concern we see, especially among moms. That's their kids will be underdeveloped. There's a big chunk of concern about employment and how jobs are changing, and it's, in my opinion, very well merited in that a lot of functions which I might have hired for a few years ago, I now am not tempted to hire for because I know how quickly and well the work can be done otherwise with AI. And then the third bucket is this existential concern, which is that we're not just building a powerful technology, we're building a technology with the aim of making it smarter than ourselves. And in some ways it already is. We know, for instance, that the last anthropic model, maybe you've talked about this, the mythos model, had found ways into the most secure systems, whether it's banks, companies, government agencies, that hundreds of human hackers and security professionals had not found. So that means AI is able to achieve objectives that the smartest humans have not been able to do, and consequential objectives, like breaking into banks. And so when you combine that capacity with independent agency, which is what we're doing with these agentic models, is they can make their own decisions and they can connect between systems and they can work together. And then you make them smarter than humans. You're creating something which kind of feels like a superior species. And when you do that, you need to make sure that it's very much aligned with what you want to happen in your society. Otherwise, you start to pursue other goals. So I think Americans feel those threats. And if we go back to the September 11th example that Nicole mentioned, the common enemy is sometimes the motivating force you need for people to come together. And with AI, I think it's not necessarily a common enemy, but there is at least a common threat that people feel.
That's scary. Or it's going to unify us.
Or it's going to unify us.
Shall we do a good for the soul? Because maybe we should.
Let's do some good for the soul.
Let's lift this up. All right, Stephen, what is your good for the soul?
I am about halfway through this book by Rutger Bregman. I'll hold it up.
Okay.
I don't know this gentleman. I'm not doing this, as part of any kind of partnership. But it's a great book called Moral Ambition. And subtitle is Stop Wasting Your Talent and Start Making a Difference. And I really like this because I have in recent years started to identify with the idea of being an idealist. And At the same time, I'm a researcher, which requires critical thinking and skepticism and data and objectivity. And I have found this book to be heartwarming, but not in a way which is naive. It's all about finding the intersection between what is possible and what is worthwhile. And I've got a lot of respect from him. He takes a historical perspective and shows cases where people might have left their job and then they go find out that they can find a solution to something like getting malaria nets to hundreds of thousands of people in certain areas of sub-Saharan Africa that weren't getting them, and save thousands of lives, and do so in a way which reflects a very pragmatic way of understanding what's needed. So I really like this book, Moral Ambition. That's my heartwarming take.
All right, right on. We will put that in the show
awesome.
notes. That's awesome.
So now's the time of the show that we play the Would You Rather game. Would you rather see anonymous social media accounts be banned or 24-hour cable news? Which is funny because I wrote this question, a week ago,
Yeah,
Nicole?
yeah.
And you talked about both of these things earlier, and I'm like, he's playing right into our hands here.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. That's a well-posed question. I would ban the social media. I would ban the social media anonymous accounts. One, because I worry about foreign interference. We know that the Russian, the Chinese, the Iranians are using social media to pursue political goals in the American population. The Chinese TikTok is educational. The American TikTok is garbage that divides you and makes you insecure and depressed. That's not an exaggeration.
Right.
They know that they're giving us a product which has cancerous social effects, and then they're giving one which has edifying social effects in China. So if we could ban the anonymous accounts, I think that would be a good thing for us. What would you say?
I would agree.
I would agree.
And as Nicole and I talked about this question, I said, even when I wrote out 24-hour cable news, it's really not even 24-hour cable news anymore that people are getting their news from. I mean, I think more people are listening to podcasts or, other news sources.
Or Instagram.
Or Instagram or TikTok or chat, So I think, I think it is. I think social media, and we've done a lot of different podcasts on, the demise of our country because of social media, for sure.
So do you have a would you rather for us, Stephen?
I do. Would you rather be constrained to your hometown where you live now for the rest of your life, or be on a traveling cruise ship forever?
Oh, God.
But you can't disembark. And it's going to different places, so you get to see the world, but you have to always sleep on the ship, and you don't ever get to step foot on land again.
This is an easy one for me, sorry. I'm not getting on a damn ship ever. Ever. With this, it's a traveling petri dish.
That's right.
Full of germs.
That's right. Between COVID, the hantavirus?
Yeah.
Okay, so I live in New York City and I live in Utah, I guess I have to choose one. And I'm with Jolene. Listen, traveling is my happy place. I can't imagine not being able to see the world. I think it's the most incredible. If you have the chance and the means to be able to do it, you can't learn more about being alive, really, than I think learning about other people and seeing where they live and how they walk through the world. But a cruise ship? Yuck. Listen, we will never get sponsored by a cruise line, ever. Because We've Got to Talk wants nothing to do with cruise ships. What do you think, Stephen? What would you do?
I think I'm right there with you. I have been on one cruise. The buffet was great. Some of the live entertainment was pretty good. And we shouldn't, I won't share this with my sister. My sister is a cruise line performer. She is a traveling acrobat.
Oh my
And
gosh,
so
that's so cool.
She has a very cool life, and she's been all over the world for work and gets to perform on cruise ships. But yeah, no, I'm with you. I live in D.C. I would restrain myself to living in D.C. and find that a reasonable trade-off.
I mean, if you had said that you couldn't disembark, that would be different. Maybe.
Yeah.
That's a really good question you just asked.
That is actually a good question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You might be competing with your We've Got to Talk, or your Would You Rather savvy, Jolene.
All right.
Well, I tested this one out before I came on, and we got competing answers. The three of us
you?
agreed, but we had people
Really?
who said, I would love to be on the cruise. I love the buffet.
Okay. And the entertainment.
Yeah.
Love the entertainment.
Yeah.
The entertainment.
It's
Yeah.
true.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
That would be a reason. Stephen,
amazing.
thank you so much.
Thank you very
we
much.
could have listened to you all day
Yes.
long. So we so appreciate your time and the work that you've done, and we're fans. So keep it up, and thank you for taking time to be with us today.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you
And-
so much for your support.
And Stephen, can you tell our listeners and viewers where to find More in Common?
Yes. So you can go to moreincommonus.com, and I'd encourage you to follow our newsletter where you can keep up with all of our work. And that's where you can also go to the beyondmaga.us website and read the report.
Okay. And we will put all of that stuff in the show notes as well. Thank you very much, Stephen. We really appreciate you being here.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye.
We've Got to Talk is produced across the world by the wildly talented, creative, and hilarious team at Bambi Media. Our theme song is Jump Jive Swing by Space Train Unlimited. Thank you so much for listening, and join us every week for another episode of We've Got to Talk.